Okay, everybody. Hello. Here we are at class number 7 for um, uh, for quantitative and qualitative research. I do apologize. Let me start with an apology. I am typically when I do talks, I try to have my notes on a big computer behind me, which allows me to look at the notes while also um, uh, looking straight at the screen. For some technical reasons, my notes are, I have the screen split here. So I have my notes off to my right and the Zoom meeting off to my left. The camera is still in the middle. But if periodically it looks like I'm slightly not looking straight at the camera, but looking slightly left, that's why, because my notes are over here. I also want to let you know that I've made a slight change in the presentation schedule as on the syllabus. Not a major change, and it won't really um, impact on what you're doing for assignments. In fact, I did it in part to help. And what I mean here is the lectures this week were supposed to be about interpreting statistics and finding bias in research. And I decided instead to start the introduction to qualitative research this week. There are a couple of reasons why. One is I kind of felt like we kind of did statistics last time. I don't know that I'm feeling a strong need to go much more into statistics. And when I do, if there's a need, we certainly can hold it till um, week 10 or week 9. Week 9 and 10 would be when I'd expect to start mixed method. I think it's scheduled to be week 10. I was thinking we might start it uh, partly during week 9. But mixed method is both quantitative and qualitative together. So we certainly can look at any additional issues regarding statistics at that time. Um, I decided that I wanted to start qualitative because I've taught the be, again because I thought we did statistics pretty well, and um, when I've taught this class before, I have thought that it'd be nice to have a little bit extra time with qualitative research. I had given it in the syllabus 2 weeks, week 8 and week 9, and I thought, well, maybe we'll start at week 7 and see if it might be a good thing to stretch it out a little bit more, because qualitative, my experience in this course is students have a lot less experience with qualitative. Those were some legitimate reasons. To be honest, the other reason that I really wanted to do it here is I realized that you have your um, uh, sort of basic research proposal due this week. And my thinking was that I'd like to touch base on helping you understand qualitative research in case we've talked about your research proposals both being quantitative, but I thought an introduction to qualitative might help you decide if you might want to look at that approach instead. So for those reasons, I decided that this week I would start the qualitative research topic with the idea that the anything additional regarding statistics and anything additional regarding looking for bias, we can sort of hold over to when we talk about mixed methods, where it certainly would be an important issue there as well. So, as I've said a couple times in this course, in my experience, qualitative research is something that students often don't understand very well. If the difficulties with quantitative research, specifically when it comes to statistics, are overstated, I believe that some of the difficulties with qualitative research can be understated. A lot of times when I've talked to students, they've had just sort of the general impression that qualitative research is primarily interviews and surveys, and that basically um, you have you conduct interviews with people and you analyze the results, and that's certainly part of it, but it's a much more complex procedure than that. It's a very structured way to approaching the interpretation um, of interviews and surveys. So I thought that looking at some of the basic ways that qualitative research is conducted would be important. Qualitative research is essentially using interviews and using surveys and giving the participants, very often in qualitative research, what we would call subjects in a quantitative research study are called participants in a qualitative research study. And very often with qualitative research, what you end up doing is getting very detailed interview results from a smaller group of participants, as opposed to having a larger number of subjects that you would use for a quantitative research study. So qualitative research has been getting a lot more attention in recent decades. It it started getting more and more attention in the 70s and 80s when it was becoming clearer that quantitative research was limited in terms of what it provided. There had been such a strong emphasis throughout the history of psychology on quantitative research, on following the scientific method, that the idea that understanding human beings was much more complex than could be um, determined from using questionnaires and tests um, and different types of experiments, which were much more limited in the material they provided. That was becoming clearer and clearer that quantitative research really didn't offer the opportunity to understand the complexity of human experience. So qualitative research had been around for a good while. Actually, it's kind of interesting that qualitative research had sort of some of its beginnings in research that was done for literary analysis and analysis of different texts. And a lot of times um, some of the materials that were that came out of uh, literary analysis, the analysis of novels, the analysis of stories, to find what sort of themes were reflected as far as common human experiences. Um, that idea of using that sort of analysis was applied to finding themes when basically people told their own stories and gave their own descriptions of their experiences. Qualitative research involves the collection, analysis, and interpretation of data by observing what people do and say. So very often what qualitative researchers are looking for are meanings, concepts, definitions, characteristics, metaphors, symbols, and descriptions of things. Qualitative research is a very subjective approach to research. It uses very different methods for collecting information. Um, and that includes, as I've said, in-depth interviews and even the use of focus groups. The research tends to be open-ended. In this way, it is very different from quantitative research. Quantitative research tends to be close-ended. The questions tend to be close-ended. We Quantitative research will often use things like what is called the Likert scale. The Likert scale is where an individual rates different things on a scale of 0 to 5. In that way, it is very close-ended. Qualitative research tends to be open-ended questions that allow for a lot of interpretation, a lot of description, and room for response from the participants. It's exploratory. Very often, qualitative researchers will approach their research by having not only a number of survey questions, but also a number of sub questions, which will be sort of the planned questions that the qualitative researcher will ask if the person doesn't give quite enough detail in their initial response to the question. So very often, qualitative researchers will have plans for how to get more information for the person or how to explore concepts more. And in that way, as I said, qualitative research is considered not only open-ended, but also exploratory. Some of the strengths of qualitative research is it's good for examining feelings and motivations. It allows for complexity and depth of issues. And it provides insights into real life situations. So examines feelings and motivations, allows for complexity and depth of issues, and provides insights into real life situations. But there are weaknesses for qualitative research as well. Qualitative research can't extrapolate to the whole population. So if you think about what you're doing for qualitative research, is you're trying to get from the participants sort of an idea of the general themes that come out, but you can't necessarily say this applies to the whole population. In that way, not that this terms apply, but in that way, if you remember back when we talked about parametric and non-parametric, it's very consistent with the non-parametric, where you have useful information about the group that you are analyzing, but you're not really looking at the whole population. In fact, very often a big part of qualitative research is trying to identify who exactly makes up the group that you have just found information about. And so oftentimes that can be a big part of qualitative research. Some of the other weaknesses with qualitative research is you get a lot of data. You have these lengthy interviews with long responses, and sometimes it can be very, very difficult to sort of maneuver through the vast amounts of data that you can gather when you're collecting a bunch of interviews. The analysis in qualitative research can be complex. The method of analysis can also be very time consuming. Some of the things that make qualitative research particularly time consuming is a lot of the interpretation methods will require you to transcribe all the interviews or have all the interviews transcribed, which can be rather lengthy. Very often too, the analysis of qualitative research often requires that you have more than one individual interpreting the results. So very often what will happen is you will need to have other people involved to make sure that there is consistency in the results that you have. Okay, so um, as I said, with qualitative research, you often have a large amount of data that requires a very complex method of analysis. It's interesting that as difficult as statistics can be in some situations, it's actually um, quite um, it's not, I mean, it can be complex, but it's actually pretty straightforward. As I said last week, you basically collect the data, put the data into some sort of statistics program, run the analysis, find out if your analysis is significant at the 0.05 level, and then use that for interpretation. It's pretty straightforward. Qualitative research is quite complex. It requires a lot of different types of analysis, looking for themes, looking for different um, uh, approaches that the person has used to explain themselves. Um, just looking at it in a very subjective way to try to understand the person's perspective, the person's experiences. And that can be rather time consuming and rather difficult. And as I said before, um, you know, understanding um, the amount, basically, you have this large amount of data, and as I said before, the question could be, okay, I have all this data. Now, what do I do with it? And so, um, trying to go about determining what to do about that is is um, quite a large undertaking. A lot of different types of qualitative research studies. We will try to get through examples of each of them. But you know, when you are doing I'm going to start here with a basic qualitative study, and a basic qualitative study would be um, basically how, it would be a study of how um, participants make meaning of a situation or a phenomenon. And typically, what a basic qualitative research study would do is it would involve collecting data from interviews, um, observations of responses that subjects give during interviews, or analysis of documents, possibly, for example, being written works by students. And what you are doing is you are trying to find patterns or common themes of these interviews or written works. And here's an example. 45 example of a basic qualitative study. 45 women from different backgrounds um, um, and talking to them about their developmental patterns, how they developed psychologically, and basically also how they dealt with turmoil in their life. So what the interviewer, so a basic qualitative research study would be um, taking interviews of 45 women and talking to them, interviewing them about the developmental patterns that they have found throughout their lives. And then what's done with this study, um, and when they interview the women about how they have dealt with turmoil, tumultuous periods throughout their life, um, the results are then compared to earlier findings uh, from qualitative research on male development. Very often, this is what you have with basic qualitative studies: is that they'll have interviews about a certain group, in this case, women, and then they won't try to compare one group to another. The qualitative research will focus on that one group, and then the results of that study will be compared to another study. So it's not seen as the study, this one study. What is seen in these one studies is they do pull out the themes, the interpretation, the subjective experiences of the participants. But the goal of this is not to is not to um, um, is not to answer questions across the board, like, how does this one group compare to this other group? But it's to really describe this one group, whatever group is being chosen, and then the results are then compared to the results of another study involving um, another group. So qualitative research is really very focused on describing one group in a lot of detail, not necessarily comparing it to another group, but then the material from the one study is taken to compare to a group in another study. Um, some general rules about the qualitative research method. Um, Again, first, I've got a bunch of rules here. I forget how many rules I have. I have 14. Um, just 14, just general rules to keep in mind as we sort of understand, talk more about qualitative research over the next couple weeks. One is the most obvious, that qualitative research means getting away from the idea of counting, the idea of numbers, because that's the focus of quantitative research. The focus on quantitative research is bringing everything back to numbers, amounts, degree, levels, order, the order of things. You're moving away from that. Second rule, the focus of qualitative research is on subjective experiences, or the meanings that people use, which is an extremely worthwhile endeavor. But if you think about that concept, also an extremely difficult thing to accomplish, to really focus on the person's subjective experience and to gather information that tells you sufficient amounts about the person's subjective experience in order to understand that. Um, there is a strong focus on language, and very often written text, whether the written texts are what the person wrote themselves or whether a transcription of what the person said during an interview. There's a strong focus on language, the idea that meaning can only be interpreted through language. People explain themselves through language. Even if they are expressing unconscious material, they usually do it through language. It just may be that they're not aware of all the language that they are doing and what that language is actually reflecting. Um, very much focused on the next role is there's a strong emphasis on trying to get what's going on in the person's head, what's going on in their brain, um, in as complicated a manner as it needs to get in order to understand what the person is thinking. Qualitative research tends to be very localized. You are studying one group of people in one area. And like I said, the idea is that if you can in a great deal of detail understand that small group, that understanding can be compared to other understandings of other small groups. Next role, observations and findings in qualitative research depend on understanding contexts and the meanings that people hold about those contexts. So there's a lot of emphasis in qualitative research on trying to understand not only the meanings that people have, but the contexts of those meanings. When you observe the person's behaviors during responses, it's often in the midst of smaller group interactions. So qualitative research often involves individual interviews, but also often involves um, small group interactions, small group activities, small focus groups. Exploration is very often the motive. So you kind of start with the general open-ended question that you have, but you certainly often don't end there. You try to build on it. You try to explore what whether the person has more to say. So there's a lot of exploration. Now, the thing is, and this is where I was trying to get at about uh, um, this is what I was trying to get at when I talked about how um, uh, when I was trying to get at um, how qualitative research is often under emphasized in terms of complexity. This is what I meant, because even though exploration is a very important part of much qualitative research, the exploration itself is not a sort of like, you know, see the pants type of thing where you just kind of go with the flow sort of. Usually the plan for how to address the exploration is planned out ahead of time. That's what I meant before about you often have sub questions. So if something comes up where more detail is needed or you want to expand on it, oftentimes the researcher will plan ahead about what sorts of questions they're going to use for the exploration. Um, Qualitative research often focuses on causes rather than effects. It tends to be inductive, um, which means you get a lot of information. You try out to pull out some specific themes from it. Um, Qualitative research tends to be flexible, and it can change given the needs of the research. So, in fact, some qualitative research, as we talk about it in more detail, you'll see sometimes the plan is for the research to change after each participant. So after one interview is done, it's not like that once you start the interview method, you're kind of locked in. Very often qualitative research will change their research methods, you often in just small ways, but they will build on their research methods as they do more and more interviews. So the interviews themselves are in flux depending on the needs of the researcher. Um, and um, and that often, this is the next role, oftentimes um, not only the research needs to be reflexive, but the researcher has to be reflexive too. The researcher has to be sort of aware of their own responses to what's going on. And so the researcher needs to be aware of themselves as a tool in the research and the impact that they may be having on the research. It's interesting that one um, sort of area of concern that's always been in place in quantitative and particularly experimental research is what role does the experimenter have in influencing the experiment? At what point do the subjects of the experiment respond to the experimenter being there? And qualitative researchers are often asking that question. They're often very reflective of that of that um, of that impact that they can have on the research. And that moves me on to the next rule of qualitative research. That qualitative research tends to be not only practical and logical, but also very critical of itself. Researchers are constantly asking the question, am I accurately depicting the social world given the ways that I am collecting and analyzing my data? So qualitative research often tends to be very critical within the research itself. The qualitative researcher will be asking themselves, how accurately is this collection of data? And the other role to always keep in mind is good qualitative research can often be very difficult to conduct, very detailed, lots of details, lots of analysis. I'm going to pull up, I'm going to share something here on the screen. When I talked about, these were notes I was using, and when I talked about inductive research, this is what I want to mean. This is what I mean. Quantitative research tends to be deductive. In other words, theory leads to the hypothesis, and then the hypothesis leads to the data collection. So deductive goes from the goes from the theory, the general theory, to a very specific hypothesis. So from the smaller to the larger. I'm sorry, no, from the larger to the smaller. This theory, this very general theory, tends to lead to specific hypotheses, and that leads to data collection. So quantitative research tends to be deductive. Qualitative research tends to be inductive. It goes from it goes from the small to the large. The data collection leads to, instead of hypothesis, generalizations. The generalizations of the different themes, the different meanings, the different evidence of personal experiences that come out of the data analysis in qualitative research. And then that leads to theory. Sort of the general rule of quantitative versus qualitative is quantitative is guided by the theory. Qualitative leads to the theory. Theory often comes out of qualitative research. And then that theory can be used to guide quantitative research. And so, so deductive is from the large to the small. That's quantitative research, from the large theory to the smaller hypothesis, the more specific hypothesis. Qualitative tends to be inductive. It tends to go from the smaller data, the collection of data in the smaller groups, to development of the larger theory. Okay. And so like I said, um, quantitative research tends to be guided by the theory. Qualitative research uh, tends to uh, tends to guide tends to develop theory. Okay. Hang on one second here. Okay. Let me just pull up my next okay. Um, so qualitative goes from the observation to finding the patterns, and then that leads to the theory. Um, so um, qualitative also, this isn't a rule, but this is another thing about qualitative in general. Qualitative allows for more explicit expression of the researcher's values. The one thing that's also particularly interesting about qualitative research is um, qualitative research is um, uh, often is guided by values. Social, there's a specific type of qualitative research that we'll talk about that is specifically focused on finding uh, on finding research results that can help improve society. That the only that it is openly focused. Quantitative research stresses a great deal of objectivity. Qualitative research does not tend to emphasize objectivity that much. There often is a great deal of emphasis on saying we are trying to find answers because we want to make society better. This is not a value free approach to understanding a phenomenon. We are trying to do something that we think will better society. Now, it's objective in terms of the results, in terms of the person saying, okay, these are the results we found, but our only way of having any value to these results is by doing so in a way that it can help improve society. And uh, so that sort of idea that values like that um, uh, can be openly expressed, openly a part of it is an interesting part of qualitative research. It's interesting to think too about qualitative research. If you think about it, throughout the history of psychology, throughout the history of almost any social science, the theory was often guided by authors. Freud, Jung, Erickson, Maslow. Well, Maslow did some experiments. Um, Even Skinner, who did B.F. Skinner, who did experiments, but wrote, you know, lengthy books about uh, 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 theoretical perspectives. Um, Viktor Frankl, logotherapy, search for meaning. They were authors who wrote, the theories came from their writings, and then those grand theories were put to the test with quantitative research. Qualitative research is just seen as a way of sort of generating those theories that come from more philosophical, more conceptual background and giving a structured process to it. So the process by which you come up with the theory is seen as structured, as opposed to just um, authors who kind of take whatever approach they think works for them. Not there's anything wrong with some of the great with the great authors, but qualitative research sort of takes that same approach, this idea of generating theory, but doing so in a structured way, as I said, as opposed to the old way of coming up with theories, which were coming from authors who took whatever approach they thought worked for them. Okay, some questions about qualitative research. Basically, the questions that I wanted to focus on here is when should you use qualitative methods? When are qualitative methods the most appropriate? And um, um, with qualitative methods, they are most appropriate when the variables can't be quantified. When you're focused on variables that you can't quantify. When variables are best understood in the natural settings, that there's no sort of like artificial environment, whether it's an experimental lab or even an office where a person answers questionnaires. But when the variables are best understood in their natural settings, when variables need to be studied over real time, um, when you can't control when that's what that means when you can't control when the variables are being studied, when you need to get into details about roles, processes, and group functioning, and really when your paramount goal of the research is trying to understand the person, that's when qualitative research comes into play. Some things that you need to be, some skills that you need to have if you approach research from a qualitative direction. You need to have a lot of understanding of the methodology and nature, not only the nature of the issue that you're studying, of the topic that you're studying, but the nature of qualitative research. You need to understand the process, the methodology. Uh, when you're doing qualitative research, some other skills that you need is you need to be familiar with your own biases, assumptions, expectations, and values. You have to be interested in listening. You have to be a good, really, you have to have listening skills in order to be a good qualitative researcher. You need to be open to embracing multiple perspectives from different individuals. And you have to be prepared for very lengthy transcripts, very lengthy responses from people. You have to be ready to deal with those. Um, some other things to keep in mind about qualitative research. It's easy to get carried away with qualitative research. There is so much data that can be put in front of you that you have to, can quickly get out of hand. So you have to be very careful about trying to put some sort of limit on the data you collect. Very often that comes from being very clear about your research focus. You can't try to answer all the questions that are possibly out there. Focus on the most, so being very focused is important for qualitative research because because the answers uh, can get quickly out of hand. When you are so, as I said, and this will be where I finish. When you are doing in-depth interviews, I talked about how there are often sub questions, and very often uh, questions will build. As I said, we'll have sub questions, and I have an example up here. This was a qualitative research study done on the impact of qualitative research on people's preference for larger cars. And so it starts off, why do you like wide bodies? In cars, wide bodies. Why do you like wide bodies? That was the first question. They're more comfortable, was a person's response. Why is that important? So very often that'll be how a qualitative research will work, is you will start with a question about the product or about the phenomenon that you're asking about. And then when the person gives a response, you will ask, your next question will often be about asking why the person found that important. And very often with qualitative research, asking why is that important may be a question that you ask 2 or 3 different times. In this example I have here, there was an example of, why do you like wide bodies in the car? They're more comfortable. Why is that important? I can accomplish more when I drive. Why is that important? It helps me feel good about myself. So notice how the question, why is that important, was asked twice. Very often that's what happens with qualitative research, is you will start with one sort of general question, but then you will ask questions that are more about the individual's personal experiences. I also want to talk a little bit about focus groups. Focus groups are, so it's not always that you collect data for qualitative research using individuals. You also will often use focus groups, which are loosely structured interviews that are conducted with a small number of participants, all seen at the same time. Usually focus groups have 8 to 12 members. They may have different views, but they tend to be homogeneous in terms of demographics. Very often you keep them for a half hour to an hour. And very often you will tape or record them. Sometimes qualitative researchers will use individual they will use individual interviews, but then they'll also bring people in, those same people in, for a focus group, and see if they get different answers that the person is met with individually, but then if they're also in some sort of small group setting. Okay, I think it's enough for now. And I will look forward to seeing everybody on Thursday, and we'll pick up this discussion of qualitative research.